Hey everybody, my name is Stephen Pettigrew. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in the Department of Government here. So Kirk mentioned this morning that we modeled this conference after the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, where they try to bring together researchers and people that work for teams and people in the media. So the idea of this conference was to bring all those people into the same room as well, but in the political sphere. And so I've gone to that conference a few years in a row, and so when Kirk and Ryan introduced me, or when they suggested that they were going to be running this conference, they asked if I would be willing to organize a research paper competition, which is a big part of the Sloan conference. So we put out a call for papers about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit less than that, and we had several dozen submissions that were really high quality research papers. And so I put together a group of graduate students in the government department, many of whom are here. Jason Sklar, Melissa Sands is around here. And they helped me read all these papers and pick the two best papers that we felt like were the best quality research, but also they would have general interest to an audience like this. So the first presentation today is going to be by Alex Hertel-Fernandez. Alex is a PhD candidate in the Government and Social Policy program at Harvard. His research focuses on how employers recruit their workers into politics, and you can look for his forthcoming book, Politics at Work, which I think is an awesome title. He is defending his dissertation in a few weeks, and this summer he is taking a job on the faculty at Columbia University where he'll be an assistant professor. The second presentation will be by Bradley Spahn. He's a doctoral candidate in the political science department at Stanford. His research focuses on voter behavior as well as sources of bias in survey data. And so you'll see in his presentation how he'll touch on both of those two subjects. So Alex and Bradley are each going to talk for about 15 minutes. And then Ryan Enos, our conference organizer, he's going to take over and we'll open it up to questions and he'll call in you guys. So, and we'll be running around with microphones. So with that, I introduce Alex.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks so much for the opportunity to present this research. It's really a privilege to be able to present some of this work in progress on how employers recruit their workers into politics to such an interesting group of people. So I wanted to start my presentation with an episode from the 2012 elections, which at this point probably seem like a lifetime ago, but take yourself back, if you will, to August of 2012. And in that month, Mitt Romney made a campaign stop just outside of Bealsville, Ohio, at a coal mine there to give a speech attacking the energy policies of President Barack Obama. And you can see Mitt Romney up there at the podium delivering his address, and he's flanked by a number of coal miners, some with coal-stained faces from their shift earlier in the day. It makes for a really striking visual composition. You can also see the coal miners lining up to attend the rally in the lower picture here. This might not seem all that unusual. In the midst of a highly competitive presidential election, candidates make hundreds of these stump speeches all the time. But this event was different. And it was different because the Ohio coal miners were required to be there by their managers. They were told that the event would be, quote, both mandatory and unpaid. Now, after this story broke, managers walked back their statement, and they said that although the event was mandatory, no one would be required to show up. But workers told a different story. As I think your chuckling recognizes. They said to reporters that they showed up even if they disagreed with Mitt Romney, and even if they didn't want to be there because they were afraid of losing their jobs or being punished in some way by their managers. Now, when I first read about the Ohio coal mine story, I was surprised, but I assumed it was an outlier in American politics. Employers don't really act as political recruiters. That's something we leave up to campaigns or unions. But I was wrong. Just a few weeks later, there was insufficient data for an image. Just a few weeks later, there was a story in the New York Times, which, if it was pictured here, would say, here's a memo from the boss, vote this way, describing how a number of employers had begun sending messages to their workers in order to recruit those workers into politics. And some of those messages even endorsed candidates for the presidency.
I'm going to try and fix this.
Okay.
Keep talking.
Okay.
No further mentions, sorry.
Sounds good. And if you could see the picture, it would have a picture of a timeshare CEO from Florida named David Siegel. And some of you might recognize the name. He was the star, along with his wife, of the hit documentary The Queen of Versailles, which was about the housing crisis, and also about his quest with his wife to build the largest home in America, named What Else? Versailles. But the article pictured him there because he had been sending messages to his employees at his Florida timeshare company telling them that he might need to make cuts to their benefits and their wages if they didn't vote for Mitt Romney and congressional Republicans. Any luck?
I'm really sorry. The images are just not coming up.
Okay. Maybe if we don't do it in full screen, would that help?
No, the entire PDF is gone.
Oh, okay.
It's just corrupted somehow.
Okay, well, we can press on without the visual aids, unfortunately. So this surprised me when I read this New York Times article. Unless you think that that was only a phenomenon of the 2012 election, in 2014, a business association called the Business Industry Political Action Committee organized a campaign to get employers to talk to their workers about the election, to, quote, impact the election by electing business-friendly, pro-free market candidates. And most recently, just a few weeks ago, in this current electoral cycle, Starbucks, the major coffee chain, along with Marriott, the global chain of hotels and resorts, announced big campaigns to get their employees registered to vote and turned out to vote in the 2016 elections. Those efforts were different, though, because they were generally nonpartisan, and they made a strong effort to say that they weren't going to endorse any candidates. So all of these stories collectively fascinated me, and they form the basis for the reason that I'm starting this project on how employers recruit their workers into politics. And I was hoping to share with you today 3 core findings that have emerged from my research. One of them is just the prevalence of this practice. You know, we even lack data up until recently on how common this was. A second question that I wanted to address for you was, what are the effects of this? You know, how do workers respond to these messages, and how do companies report that these sorts of practices fit in with their other political behaviors? And lastly, I wanted to reflect a little on the normative implications of employer political recruitment of workers, whether or not we should think that this is a good thing for democracy, or whether we should think that it's more concerning. So on to the first question, how common is this? Well, in order to answer that question, I first looked to the major political science surveys that we're all familiar with, things like the General Social Survey, the American National Election Studies, and to my surprise, none of these surveys asked about employer political recruitment. So I had to go out and field my own surveys, one nationally representative telephone survey of workers, which I fielded in April of 2015, and then a series of surveys of top corporate managers at large American companies over the course of 2014 and 2015. And together, those 2 surveys, along with interviews that I've been conducting with managers at randomly sampled companies, form the basis of my evidence for this project. So what have I found? In all, according to the survey of top corporate managers that I fielded along with YouGov, I found that about half of all of the sampled firms reported that they did at least one thing to recruit their workers into politics. About half, 46%. And we might be interested in knowing, well, what are the sorts of messages that firms are giving to their workers? By and large, the most common type of message was about registering to vote and turning out the vote. The next most frequent type of information related to policy and legislation. And this took a couple of different forms. This could be an employer telling their workers about the expected consequences of a bill, say a trade bill or the Affordable Care Act, on their industry or on their firm. And it could also include efforts by employers to contact their workers and to get them to contact their lawmakers to lobby on behalf of a bill. So your employer might send you an email and say, you know, Alex, I really want you to contact your representative, here's your representative, to lobby for us on behalf of a particular piece of legislation at the state level or at the federal level. Now, for the purposes of separating out the normative implications of all of this, we might be interested in knowing how much of this contact is just about getting out the vote and how much of it is political. According to the firm survey, I found that slightly over half of mobilizing firms gave information to their workers that went beyond just get out the vote messages and included messages about legislation or endorsing political candidates or parties for upcoming elections. So that's the firm perspective. What about the worker perspective? Well, according to the nationally representative telephone survey of workers that I fielded, about 1 in 4 workers reported that they had ever received a message from their employer about politics, about 1 in 4. And we might be interested in knowing, how does that stack up against other political recruiters with which we're more familiar? And I think a natural counterpoint here is the labor movement. The labor movement, as we know, for many years has been talking about politics with workers in the workplace. So I asked workers on this survey how many of you had heard from a labor union about politics at your main job. And about 12% said that they had ever received a message about politics from a labor union at their main job, about half the share that reported ever receiving messages from an employer. I don't think that should come as a surprise, given that we know that the labor movement has suffered such declines over the past few decades. So that covers the first question that I wanted to address, just how common is all of this? The next question that I wanted to address for all of you was, what are the effects of employer political recruitment on politics? And we can think about this in a number of different ways. One way of getting at this is to ask workers themselves who have received a message from their employers, did that message change anything about your political outlooks, or did it change anything about the way that you behave in politics? And in all, about half, 47% of workers who had received a message from their employer said that they had changed one of their political behaviors or attitudes as a result of their employer's political messages, about 47%. And we can drill down and see what were the most frequently reported responses that workers gave when they received these messages. According to the survey, the most frequently reported responses were registering to vote and turning out to vote. But a non-trivial share of workers, about 15%, said that their vote choice was affected by employer political messages. And another 15% said that they were more likely to volunteer for a political cause or a political candidate as a result of their employer's political message. So that's one way of getting at the effects of these messages. Another way of getting at the effects is to ask managers themselves, just how effective is it for you to recruit your workers into politics? What can it achieve for you? And so on the survey that I fielded of top corporate managers, I asked managers to rank from least effective to most effective the different strategies that their company used to engage in policy and change public policy outcomes. And so these options included things like hiring a lobbyist, participating in a business association, giving campaign contributions, buying electoral ads, or, of course, mobilizing workers into politics. And so managers ranked these different options depending on what they reported their firm did. In all, about a third of firms that reported mobilizing their workers said that mobilization was their #1 most effective strategy for changing public policy. And in general, managers were about as likely to rank mobilization as their most effective strategy for changing public policy as they were to rank hiring a lobbyist. So managers that I surveyed generally thought of mobilization as being roughly as effective as hiring a lobbyist. Managers also ranked mobilization as being even more effective at changing public policy than giving PAC contributions to candidates, buying electoral ads, and participating in national business associations like the Chamber of Commerce. And I think the finding about campaign contributions is especially interesting because so much of our public discourse in the media, in the campaign, we need only listen to Bernie Sanders, for instance, to find out that the public perception is that campaign contributions are really the way that businesses shape policy outcomes. But at least if you ask managers themselves at companies, they're saying that mobilization of their workers is just as effective, if not more effective, than those campaign contributions. So that covers the way of thinking about the effects of employer mobilization. Lastly, I want to wrap up by reflecting on the balance of the normative balance of employer mobilization for American democracy. You know, should we think that this is a good thing, or should we be concerned about it? I think there are reasons to think that this is a good thing. Employer mobilization, I found in my work, closes some income gaps in political participation. For instance, if we look at the gradient for political volunteering, it was lower income employees that were more likely to respond to employer messages by volunteering on behalf of their employers' political causes and candidates. So in that regard, we see the income gap in political volunteering closing. We also see a similar phenomenon for voter registration, for instance. So in these ways, employer mobilization might be seen as closing socioeconomic disparities in who participates in our political process. So that's score 1 for employer mobilization of workers. But I think on the flip side, there are reasons to be concerned about this practice and its implications for American democracy. So one reason to be concerned about employer mobilization is that slightly over half of workers who were contacted by their employers said that they were either uncomfortable with those messages, they disagreed with them, or they even found those messages coercive. And I think that's problematic because it implies that some workers may be receiving messages that are pressuring them into changing their political behaviors and attitudes, not because they genuinely believe in their employer's stances, but because they want to hold on to their benefits and their wages. Another way of getting at this is to note that about 1 in 5 workers who received a message from their employer said that they had received economic warnings of job loss, wage cuts, benefit cuts, or even plant or office closures if they didn't support a particular candidate or if a particular policy passed. And I think those sorts of warnings are especially problematic because they might induce workers to change their attitudes in order to hold on to their job. I think another reason to be concerned about employer mobilization is that according to the interviews that I've conducted, a number of employers report closely tracking the political participation of their workers. So for instance, if your employer asks you to contact a lawmaker, they follow up and see, did you in fact contact that lawmaker? Since a lot of this is done through software portals, I might add, that are quite common in the grassroots advocacy and organizing community. You type in your name and it automatically knows who your representative and senators are, so they can track that sort of participation. What's more, some of the employers that I spoke with said that they rewarded workers who participated more frequently in politics. One manufacturing firm that I talked with talked about having political champions. Those were the workers who responded most frequently to political requests. And so I think this introduces the concern of political favoritism in the workplace, and perhaps even political retaliation. I didn't know this before I started the research project, but in the United States, in the private sector, there's no right to free speech or to political liberty, for instance. You could be fired potentially for your political views or actions that are unrelated to voting. And so I think that's potentially problematic. In addition, employers used to be regulated in how they could contact their workers about partisan electoral politics, but that changed in the wake of the 2010 Citizens United decision. A lot of attention directed to that decision has talked about how it opens up the possibility for companies to spend unlimited sums in politics. But that decision also makes it possible for employers to send unlimited partisan or electoral appeals to their workers, and even requiring their workers to participate in politics as a term of their employment. So those are the balance of things on the side that I think cause us to be concerned about employer mobilization and its implications for American democracy. So to wrap up, what are the 3 things that I want you to take away from this presentation, which I'm sure would be far more memorable if you got to see my slides. But the first thing is that we should be thinking about employer mobilization as a source of political recruitment. Just as we focus on labor unions, civic organizations, churches, campaigns, and candidates as getting out the vote and producing political participation, so too should we think of employers in this way. Second, I think we should think about employer mobilization as a means for business to change public policy and politics. Just as we study lobbying and campaign contributions, so too should we look at the ways that employers are engaging their workers in politics. And lastly, I think we need to have a public discussion over the appropriate role of employers in the civic lives of their workers. As I mentioned, there may be some concern for political intimidation or retaliation in the workplace, and that, I think, ought to spur a discussion of whether or not we should have national or state legislation that would protect workers from political discrimination on the job. So thank you so much for your time. Apologies for the technical glitches, and I look forward to your feedback and your questions.
I guess I'll take that. I'm actually not sure I can.
But I think that's a HTML thing, so I don't know.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that seems more promising.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can definitely see it.
Okay. Yeah. I'm definitely not at that level of memorization. Yeah, that was amazing.
What do you think is the probability that we're going to...
So the issue.
By the time we can do half of the questions now.
Well, that's what I was about to ask. What's the probability?
I think we should do the questions now.
Okay, so let's do 7 minutes of questions.
Okay.
I would appreciate that. Yeah, awesome.
We're going to do 7 minutes of questions.
Okay.
Okay, due to the obvious technical difficulty, which we will get worked out, we thought it would just make more sense to field some questions for Alex right now, and I'm sure everybody has some after that amazing presentation. That he could do on his feet, by the way. Do you notice that, with no slides? So please, questions for Alex. With the mic, please.
Thank you. Fascinating topic and an excellent job presenting it. What size companies did you deal with? Is it across the board, or was it limited to very large companies?
In the research that I did, the survey
Yes.
research or the interviews?
Yeah.
So the survey research looked at firms of all sizes. The interviews that I did were randomly selected large American employers. So I tried to get at both in the work that I did. Interestingly, there isn't variation across firm size in the overall prevalence of employer political recruitment of workers, but the means through which it happens is quite different. So in smaller firms, it tends to be much more face-to-face conversations. In larger firms, it tends to be much more through emails, electronic portals, intranets, those sorts of things. And they also cover different topics too.
Over here. Yep.
Hi, my question regards, by the way, fascinating study, I think it's fantastic. So that's regards kind of the manager's messaging of the people they supervise. But I wonder if through your interviews, if there's any way to kind of study the American workplace as a place for politics. Because it seems to me that as well as these kind of formal messages as a kind of campaign tool, my intuition is that the American workplace is relatively apolitical, in that it's kind of a taboo in an American workplace to talk about politics relative to, say, places in Latin America or mainland Europe, whereby kind of culturally a workplace may be more overtly political. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the workplace in general as a political place.
Yeah, great question. And I think there are three ways of getting at this. One is, perhaps surprisingly, it turns out that the workplace is an incredibly important source of political preferences and information for American workers. There was a great study that was done a few years ago by Diane Mutz and Jeffrey Mondak, which showed that coworkers outnumbered any source of other political conversation partners for these individuals in surveys like the General Social Survey. So it tends to be the fact that individuals talk about politics a lot with their coworkers. Now, in cross-national comparison, it's relatively low, that there are other countries, especially in Western Europe, where politics are a much more frequent topic of discussion, mainly because of the presence of unions or work councils. And the third point to add is that in my worker survey that I did, I found that in places where managers were communicating with their workers about politics, coworkers were actually less likely to talk about politics with one another on sort of a more informal basis. And I think that might be because when your boss exhibits clear partisan stances or political leanings, it makes it harder to have frank and open conversations with your coworkers. And so that might be another reason why we might want to curb especially coercive and partisan messages from employers to employees.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I was just wondering, in the data, I work in organized labor, and I was wondering if you had any data about when employer objectives come against organized labor objectives, and which objective are the employees more likely to pursue? And also, did you chronicle kind of different types of manager suggestions? So I could imagine something like, we're a manufacturing plant, it's going to close. Clearly, our interests are aligned on this particular issue. We need to keep the plant open so you can keep your job, versus, well, you need to be for lower marginal tax rates, even though you're not going to qualify, but like the managers of the firm will, and so we just want to mobilize you into that project.
Yeah, so two great questions. What happens when there's a union? So if you look at the data across companies, companies are more likely to mobilize if they have a union at one or more of their establishments. And that, I find, is not because managers are coordinating with unions, but often managers are prompted into political action because there's a union in their workplace. In fact, at a unionized plant, workers are more likely to receive conservative anti-union messages from their employer rather than coordinated messages between the union and the employer. That's not to say coordination never happens. In some of my interviews, for instance, in the rail industry, managers will cooperate with unions on campaigns related to safety or regulation or when their industry is at risk. But in general, that tends not to be the case. To answer your second question about what happens when these threats are a little bit different, when interests are clearly aligned between workers and managers versus there's a more cut and dry division between what managers want and what workers want. I find, perhaps surprisingly, it was surprising to me, that the presence of an economic warning made workers more likely to respond to their employer's messages regardless of whether or not they agreed with the messages. So independent of whether or not they perceived their interests as being aligned with the employer or not, they were more likely to respond to those messages.
Okay, with that, we're going to move on to perhaps Spahn and leave some time for more questions for both of them. Thanks for your patience, man.
Cool. Yeah, no, thank you for saving my butt. Yeah, definitely could not. Do you mind moving the cursor? Yeah. Yeah, definitely couldn't have done what Alex just did. So I'm really, really glad he was listed first. Yeah, sorry, man. Okay, so this is a paper I wrote with Simon Jackman. Simon's at Stanford and ANU, and I think as of Monday at the University of Sydney. So he's a busy guy. And the paper kind of came about because we were doing all this work with voter files and survey data, and we realized that we were finding all these people for whom the voter file just wasn't accurate. They either weren't there or they were listed somewhere else. We were wondering, who are these people? And also, what does it mean to operate on the basis of a list? And so we're going to talk about the unlisted. So this big data in American elections is kind of come in, and I'm talking particularly about voter file data, to fulfill some specific needs. So the first one is that we know that contacting everyone is expensive, right? We can't go from door to door to door to door talking to everyone. And that not all contact is efficacious. We might not want to talk to non-voters. We might not want to talk to the other party's voters. We might not want to talk to crackpots, so that's a hard thing to model. And it's unclear who should be contacted and also where to contact them. We don't know everyone's address. We don't have to, we as political professionals don't know where everyone lives. And so if we want to talk to Simon Jackman, we need an address. And it's not obvious what that address is. And so what the campaigns have done is they've exploited these sort of synergies with the marketing industry, which is they have voter files, the marketing industry has lists of people, and they put them together, and we have these commercial products. And so what they're doing is they're taking state voter registration files, they go state by state by state, they collect the data, they take these marketing lists from these big data vendors like Experian and Infogroup. This is where you get indicators of do you subscribe to golf magazines? Are you a cat person? Stuff like that. And they take contact dispositions, that is who can you actually get in touch with? Then they roll it all together. And there's a ton of firms that do this now. So there's Catalyst, there's TargetSmart, L2, there's on the Democratic side, and then the Data Trust. I'm sure there are others on the Republican side. I don't know their stuff quite as well. And so we want to know a few things. So we want to know who's not on the lists, and also who do we have the wrong contact information for? Who, if we wanted to talk to them, could we actually find out where they actually live? Do they have special characteristics, or are they just like everyone else? If we found at the end of the day that the people that aren't on the lists, just a random sample of the people that are on the lists, I would say that's pretty unproblematic, but it's also really unlikely. And so I just want to, in the back of our minds, think about what's the consequence of their being absent? What do we get when we take a list-based view of the polity? And then as researchers, what biases are we introducing when we start with the lists? If we describe American politics from the list, who's not being included? So Simon is the co-PI of the ANES, and the ANES conducts in-person professional interviews. So they start with a list of addresses from the Postal Service. So no voter file data, no marketing data. It's just these are the addresses that the Postal Service delivers to. And they send, they randomly select some addresses. They select a respondent from that address. They conduct an interview. They heavily incentivize participation, right? So even if you're not interested in politics, you're probably interested in $100. So you're going to take our survey. It's going to be really helpful. We get really good response rates. And we know that non-registrants are underrepresented in the sample. We have another paper on that. But it's just much less of a problem in this particular sample than if we were doing, say, a phone survey or an internet survey. So it's a really expensive survey, but we get a little bit of a better sample because of it. So we match this data to voter files. There's 2,000 interviews, 2,006 of them give us a name. We also have an address, because that's literally where we spoke to them. We spoke to them in their living room, not me personally, other people, thank God. Yeah, I don't like talking to voters. I don't, it's true. And a birth date. And so this allows us to match them. So we went to several different vendors. For one of them, we use their matching. So we give them our name, address, date of birth. They give us back the people on their file. This was, by the way, the most successful way to match. But with the other two, what we said is, give us every one of these addresses, or give us everyone in the zip codes that we sampled in, and then we'll figure it out. And we found a few people that way too. So all in all, we found 1,693 of our 2006 named respondents, and that gives us a match rate of 89%. So what we do is we take this data and we stick it into categories. So this is the one that we know best, registered people. These are just registered voters. If you're registered at the address you live at, you end up in this category. The next category is the unregistereds. So these are people that are on a marketing list, right? Like someone knows that you live at this address, but you're not on the state voter file at that address, and there's 7% of these. The fact that you're on a marketing list, but you're pretty much means that you're like wealthier than the average bear. And so you could think of these as like the rich unregistered, but no bears. The next one is mislisted. So these are people that we found them, but we found them elsewhere. So we have a name and a birth date match, usually close by, but we know they don't live at the address that they're listed at, because we talk to them at one address and we see on the list that their address is elsewhere. And then the last one is this really interesting group that's just unlisted, can't find you. 3 different vendors have no idea who these people are. And as it turns out, they have really important differences. So we're going to do a bunch of questions. We're going to conduct some F-tests. We are going to test them individually. I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A. And we're just going to control the false discovery rate. So basically, I'm not fishing. I'm trying to do a good job of hypothesis testing, and we can talk about it later if you want. So this is the citizenship type by race. So if you're a white person, you're 75% likely to be registered. And then you have these thin little slivers in the other category. So about 8% are unregistered, 8% or 10% mislisted, and another 8 or so percent are unlisted, right? So if you're white, we know a lot about you. You're easy to get a hold of. Everything's great. But if you're a minority, and in particular if you're Black or Hispanic, it's actually much harder to get a hold of you, right? So only about 60% of Blacks and Hispanics are registered to vote. And then these huge bands of mislisted and unlisted. So for about 30% of each of these groups, even if we wanted to talk to you, even if we wanted to mobilize you, even if we wanted to get you registered to vote, we wouldn't know where to send the form. And so this is a huge problem for list-based campaigning. There's just no way from the list to reach these people. We found them because we just start with addresses and send people out into the depths of America to find them. But it doesn't scale, right? We get 2,000 interviews for $10 million, and like the Obama campaign's just not going to do that. So you could look at it the other way. You could look at the composition of these categories, and it's sort of equally striking, right? So the registered and unregistered groups, pretty white, disproportionately white. But then when you go to these marginalized groups, mislisted and unlisted, well, for the unlisted group, you almost have a majority minority group. It's 51-49. And so these people that are most marginalized by the way we handle voter data they're disproportionately minorities, and they're almost mostly minorities. The mislisted and unlisted are a lot younger than registered or unregistered. They're a lot poorer. The unlisted are about $25,000 lower in average household income than registered people. They're much less likely to own their home. And this is my personal favorite, it's uninsured. Right? So I think when the Affordable Care Act was going around, there was this big question of like, why aren't voters supportive of this? That should be helping them. There's all these uninsured people that are being helped by the Affordable Care Act. And well, it looks like the people that are actually helped by this are disproportionately in these categories that are marginalized. And so they're not voting, but they're also not people that we can get in contact with. If you're a politician going door to door, you're not going to talk to these people unless you knock on every door. And so a thing that I think of is, how do you become unlisted or mislisted? Well, if you're poorer, you're much more likely to be in these groups, right? Because to get on a marketing list, you usually have to be engaging in commerce, you've got a credit card, you've got magazine subscriptions. So richer people, much more likely to do those things than the poorer people. But the biggest one is residential tenure. So if you're someone that has moved recently, you're much more likely to have fallen off the file. That is, you're much more likely to have inaccurate information or no information about you. And so groups that are more mobile are much more likely to be unlisted and mislisted. And we know something about mobile groups, right? They're younger, they're more non-white, they're poorer. It's going to be a problem. But it's not the case that these people aren't interested in politics. So many of them do say that they pay attention to politics more than half the time, right? These blue bars and purple bars here on the right. And so they are less politically engaged than registered voters, but it's not as if there's no one here. It's really the lists that are doing the marginalization. They're less likely to have voter ID, and in particular, it's minorities mislisted and minority unlisted that are more likely to not have voter IDs. So when we think about the consequences of voter ID laws, it might not be that registered people are being excluded. Rather, it might be that people that might register wouldn't bother because they don't have ID anyways. So this is the real smoking gun graph. If you're like, Brad, like this is just noise, this isn't a real thing, like you're just shitty at matching, like you don't know what you're doing, I would say look at the levels of campaign contact, right? Because everything I just told you about the list is being reflected right here, right? So if you're registered to vote, about a third of you are reporting being contacted by a campaign. But if you're not registered, if you're mislisted or unlisted, we're talking about 5%. So the campaigns are just ignoring these people. And so if you're someone that believes that campaigns are this tool, this vehicle that brings Americans together and rallies around political choices, well, these are the Americans you're talking to. And they're a richer, whiter, and as we're about to learn, more conservative group than these ones to the right. So one last thing I want to show you is what are the politics of these people? So there's a lot of questions on this survey. One of them that was pretty interesting was, should we increase welfare spending, right? The US is sort of an outlier in having lower levels of support for the welfare state. And indeed, registered voters have a relatively low support for something like increasing federal welfare spending. But for these other groups, they have about 15% higher rates of support for enlarging the welfare state. And so if you want to ask, why doesn't America have a welfare state? Well, one reason might be that people that do support the welfare state are politically marginalized. Now here's the last one, Obama vote. Right, so our survey took place before and after the 2012 election. We asked everyone who they're going to vote for. Registered voters, 53-47 for Obama, right? That's about the right number. Registered, unregistered, these are these richer white people, 50-50. But these other groups, mislisted and unlisted, 2-1 Obama supporters, 3-1 Obama supporters. So these people that are being marginalized are disproportionately a part of the Democratic base, right? They're minorities, they're liberal, they would have voted for Obama, but the system cuts them out. And so we have some questions, which is, why are these people being cut out? Why are these poorer, younger, whiter people being excluded from our political process? Why haven't they been mobilized? You would think that the Democratic Party would be incentivized to do so, but it might be that if you're a mobile person, you're just going to fall off the list again, right? You get registered once, you move, and now you're back to the same point. And so our voter registration system is really burdening the political enfranchisement of these younger mobile people. We know that lists make campaigning more efficient. They make polling more efficient. They're great, but they come at a cost. And that cost is a bias. It makes the electorate older, whiter, and more conservative. And so when we take a list-based view of American politics, we're getting a very different America than the America our survey shows us. So thanks.
questions for Brad? Let's go over here on the left. Yep, right there.
He's coming with the mic.
And the mic.
I'm okay, I don't need it.
We'd like the people to be able to hear you, so bring in the mic, please. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really informative. I was wondering if you ran any of these numbers through any kind of, like, did you take into consideration voting propensity at all? Because when we're talking about registered voters as a group, we're not necessarily talking about likely voters. So I was curious to see how that came into the equation when you made these considerations.
Yeah. So registered non-voters and registered voters are more similar than any of these contrasts that I made. Registered non-voters are a little more liberal than registered voters, but really most of the difference is in the other groups. Yeah. But hopefully we'll have a paper about that.
Jeremy Bird.
Did you look at different states? So what I'm interested in is the difference between like battleground states and non-battleground states. I mean, the biggest answer here is that it's expensive. Did you say you spent $10 million?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't, but
Right.
someone did. Yeah, by the way, thanks to the
So
National
one of the biggest
Science
things is
Foundation.
expensive, right? And one of the few campaigns that can do this is at the presidential level.
Yeah.
And that happens in 8 states right now. So I'm just wondering if you saw a difference across states where the sample size wasn't big enough.
Yeah, the sample size wasn't big enough. The ANES also uses a clustered design, so it's very hard to get any kind of work done on geographic differences. But I would expect that in states that have had a lot of mobilization activity, like historically, that this would be less of an issue. But I don't think the data bears it out one way or the other.
Let's go to David Rothschild for the last question, please.
You were kind of referencing that the lists are causing demobilization, that the lists are leading to this situation. But is it kind of the other way around, or it could be categorized the other way around, that, as you say here, it could be an efficient decision to not try to register people who are not registered? That's costly. Then to get them out to vote is another cost. And also, for the voter files themselves, they're designed to reflect the campaigns. They're a tool of the campaigns. And so why should they be going out and categorizing people at high costs who are very unlikely to be voting if they're not even registered yet?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point, right? Like, the lists aren't made for me doing this project. They're made for Jeremy and for all the other political practitioners in the room. But I would say that, like, our voter registration system in America is an institutional choice that we've made. It's actually pretty unique amongst OECD countries. Like, it's much easier to register to vote in other places. And so if we had a system that really comprehensively followed you as you moved and made it very trivial to register to vote, like, all this would be much less of an issue. But I do take your point that, like, I don't think Catalyst should be going door to door in Alabama and figuring out who's not on the file. Though, Yair, it would be great if you guys could do that. It'd be awesome.
Let's please have a round of applause for our board of academics. We're back at 3:40.